You're good to start.
Okay, I'm calling this meeting to order at 6:33 p.m. on January 25th. And welcome then to the January 25th meeting of the CB6 Youth and Education Committee. My name is John Keller, and I'm the chair of the committee. And as I just said, this meeting is called to order at, I think I said 6:33. And fix my screen here. And tonight we are joined by Community Associate Alexandra Crawford. There are some members of the public present, and perhaps more will be here. You can raise any questions or comments that you have thought through the Q&A feature of Zoom. And if there is time following the committee's discussion, we will ask you to raise your hand and to speak and take questions or comments from you. And I know I'm told that a couple of you have come here to make comments, so I'll certainly make sure we do that. Has anyone volunteered to take minutes for tonight's meeting? I'm not sure we have a volunteer.
Yeah, we need a volunteer.
I know. Could someone volunteer to take minutes for tonight's meeting? It shouldn't be very burdensome.
I could do it.
Oh, thanks, Abby. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, I think we're doing the abridged version now, so I'll follow up with the office about that, right?
Yeah, I think that's fine, yeah.
Okay.
And the important thing is we do have the transcript and live stream. So Abigail Kruzmark is taking the minutes of tonight's meeting. You should also all have received an email from the board office with a link to a doodle sign-up sheet for minute takers at our meetings in 2022. For your convenience, the link to the sign-up sheet is being posted in the chat right now, just a subtle hint. And Alexandra, could you take attendance for the meeting, please, by roll call?
Committee members, I will call your name and you will unmute yourselves. When your name is called, please say present. I will announce if there is quorum. Asia Badi. Asia Badi. Neil Barclay.
Present.
John Keller.
Present.
Abigail Kruzmark.
Present.
Philip Napolitano. Philip Napolitano. Sean Sherman.
Present.
Claude L. Winfield.
Present.
And Stuart Desser.
Present.
We have quorum.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. The agenda for tonight's meeting was distributed ahead of time by the board office and is reflected now on the screen ahead of you, before you. If there is no objection, we'll adopt the agenda. Members of the committee, if you object to adopting the agenda, you may raise your hand through Zoom. Seeing no objections, the minutes from, seeing no objections, the agenda for tonight's meeting is adopted. The minutes from the November 23rd meeting were distributed ahead of time by the board office. If there's no objection, we will adopt the minutes as drafted. Members of the committee, if you object to adopting the minutes, you may raise your hand through Zoom. Seeing no objections, the minutes from the November 23rd meeting are adopted. They will soon be available on the CB6 website. In order to conduct an efficient meeting, let's address a few ground rules. No one may speak until granted the floor. As you know, I'm fairly flexible with people who speak, but I would appreciate, people respecting others speaking. Committee members, if you have a question about committee business or wish to make a motion, please raise your hand through Zoom. And this is something we really emphasize. The chat function should not be used for committee business or questions about agenda topics. All such remarks should be made on the record by raising your hand through Zoom. Chat should only be used to alert us to any technical difficulties you are having or to state in writing information like an email address that was already stated aloud during the meeting. When a committee member is given the floor to speak, I'll identify you and you can unmute yourself so that you can speak. And we are required by New York State law to have a transcript of the meeting. So please keep your questions and comments succinct and germane to the discussion, and don't do what I've done in the past and say things that you really wouldn't want to have in a public record. So we're going to move ahead with the adopted agenda. And Alexander, if you could put it up again, that would be helpful. Thank you.
One second, sorry.
Take your time. Okay, so first of all, we have had amended beforehand the agenda for tonight's meeting. If any of you are here because you thought any members of the public are here because you thought we were going to be discussing food issues related to school food for logistical and other reasons, we were just unable to get anyone from the DOE, and that's not casting any shade on the DOE. We just couldn't pull it together. But I'm very happy to and excited actually that we're going to be discussing a constituency and a group of students who are truly underrepresented in the education sphere and in the public sphere in New York. And that's students at state schools, schools funded by the state for private schools serving children with learning challenges. And specifically tonight, we're going to be talking about State Assembly Bill S-06516A and Assembly Bill A-0813 that effectively regarding the calculation of yearly tuition and regional rate reimbursement for approved school aid and preschool special education programs. And that was that bill, and I'm going to let Mr. Lester explain and Neil Barclay explain this in greater detail. That bill would have raised the state's contribution to the payment of these to the schools by 7% from the current 4%. And I'll let our guest explain the circumstances of the governor's veto of that. But both bills in the Assembly and the State Senate, I am reliably told, were passed unanimously. So we really want to have a discussion tonight of these schools. First of all, I have been involved in education for a long time in New York City, and I know very little about these schools. They've been below my off my radar screen, below my radar screen, and when you hear the term private schools, you frequently go to start thinking about some of the tonier private schools we have in this city, and these schools are everything but that, as I understand. And tonight we are very happy to have with us Mr. Duncan Lester, the executive director of the Reschool, which is one of the oldest nonprofit special education elementary schools in New York City. So our objective in this meeting tonight is twofold, really. One is, first of all, to give a voice to schools like the Reschool and the people here who are here from that school to speak and just simply raise the profile in the community of these schools. And secondly, to discuss at the end of the presentation we'll receive and discussion we have thereafter, whether we want to proceed with a resolution of any sort in regard to the governor's veto of this bill. As I said, it was passed by unanimous consent by unanimous vote in both the Assembly and the Senate. I'm going to hand this over now to our very able Vice Chair, Neil Barclay, who has a direct connection to the school and who is very familiar with the needs of kids in these schools, both to introduce Mr. Lester and also just give us a little more background as we move ahead. Neil, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. So as you stated, Mr. Lester is kind enough to join us this evening, and he is the executive director at the Reschool, which is located at 25 East 104th Street, right next to Museum Mile and Central Park. Just a little bit about Reese. It is one of the oldest nonprofit special education schools in New York City. And Reese, like other nonprofit special education schools, step in and they provide services to students in New York City that have learning challenges, and public schools that the DOE provide are not equipped to provide the resources and services that these children need. So schools like Reese and other schools that step in and provide those much needed services. And what, as John has said, that we had a bill, there was a bill in the Senate and in the Assembly, both passed unanimously, that would put funding for the nonprofit special education schools. The funding would be on parity, or it would have funding parity with the public schools. And so I think the best person to add more to this is Duncan, as I'm sure, well, I know that he knows a lot about the subject. And so Duncan, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, I just really want to say thank you so much for inviting me. You know, I don't get opportunities like this too often in New York City, and to see that your community board really want to help us in this area is great. We've presented in front of Community Board 11 and 10 before, because we have a board member in one of those community boards, and because our school is actually in Community Board 11 region, we've presented there too. And so, you know, I was looking through the roster earlier today, and I noticed between 4th and 42nd, which I believe is your area on the east side, we have 12 families that actually attend the Reschool. And so this really started for me back in 1991 when I was working at another 853 school. And at that time, a group of schools like us, 853s, formed a coalition to really get some sort of representation in Albany for the students that we were serving. You know, today the coalition is 106 schools strong around the state, of which 16 of those schools are actually in one of the 5 boroughs in New York City. The numbers that we poured up in 2020, we're serving about 16,000 of the most vulnerable children around the state. And as Neil mentioned, these are all public school children that for one reason or another need additional resources that their school district can often not provide. And through history, a lot of these services have either been provided by District 75 in New York City or by BOCES around the rest of the state. And so throughout the last 15 to 20 years, BOCES have started pulling away from these types of services, whereas the need has got greater to provide these types of services. And so most BOCES cannot provide enough or don't have the means or the budgets to provide them. And so these students often get referred on to an 853 school like ours. And so, one of the things that's really important, and both of you who spoke before me made it very clear, that we're often seen as like a private school, but we aren't. We're a state-funded school, and parents don't pay for the children to come to our school. We are provided a rate by New York State that any district who sends their children to our school have to provide to us. And as Neil mentioned, the rate over the last 15 years has fallen behind what has happened in public school districts. And so 2 years ago, we started pushing this concept of parity. And we lobbied up in Albany, and we were met with a lot of support from both the Senate and the Assembly. And then eventually, when it went to the governor's desk on December 28th this year, it was vetoed. And so, for us, it was a little disappointing due to the 2 years of work that we had put into it. But she did promise to review it again in the future. So we are now going around the state, getting a lot of parent advocacy groups, boards like yourself, to really help us push this back up to Albany and hopefully get it through next year. And, some of the things that this money will provide for us, or this additional funding, will be things like teacher retention. I mean, most of the 853 schools, their average retention for teachers and related service providers is 2 years. There's a constant turnover of staff. And without that consistency and that retention, it's really hard to serve some of these students. So if we can do some things like rate parity and help reform some of the methodology that's also involved up in Albany, we're also looking to talk about closing some of the workforce wage gap. Typically a teacher in New York City, DOE, will start around 65 to 67,000 for a 10-month contract, and schools like Reese and others average around 45 to 50,000. There's just no parity there, and obviously retirement and benefits are often much more healthier in public schools. So, we struggle with this and recruiting and retaining the staff. So as I mentioned, I think earlier, we're serving over 6,000 students, or we were in 2020. We're about to resurvey all the schools and get a better number, but we think that number probably has increased over the last 2 years by 10 to 15%. And so moving forward, we're asking, as Neil nicely puts it, that we could get some sort of resolution or a letter of support from people like yourselves to send up to Albany to show that we're really doing this work. One of the other facts that I was talking to Neil about right before the presentation was that several 853 schools no longer take public school children. So in New York City, there's Churchill, there's Gillen Brewer, there's Gateway. Over the last 5 years, these phenomenal schools have started only taking private pay children. And so that reduces the numbers of desks in New York City to provide these services, and services that are much needed and growing more by more each year. So also in Brooklyn, there's been 2 other schools that have actually, both through the Archdiocese of New York City, have both closed down. And when we speak to the executives at these schools, it's mainly because the rate has not grown that they get paid per student as what's happened, in public schools. So they either go private and then can charge a higher fee outside of a rate that's set by New York State, or they end up not being able to provide enough services for the amount of money that they're getting paid, and so end up closing down. And we've seen 5 examples of that in the last 4 to 5 years in New York City alone.
Mr. Lester, I know you sent a page to us. Do you want to walk through that if we could put it up? Or
Yeah, if you can put it up.
Yeah, I'm
Abby-
trying to get it.
Alexandra,
Yeah.
could you put it up? Thank you.
Sorry
So-
about that. My screen froze for a second. I'm gonna,
Thank you very much. Happy
So
to
just a
follow.
quick overview. This is something that we're going to our lobby day with in February of this year. We're going up to Albany, and we'll be on Zoom with some of the senators and assembly people. And the first part is about parity and commitment to parity, and why we really want to move in this direction. And it's very clear there that not having a predictable annual growth or trend factors, as New York State Education Department like to refer to it as, really makes it difficult for us to predict what our budget is going to be like. This year, our budget wasn't approved until middle of January. So we've worked for over 6 months on a possible budget. We didn't know whether it was going to be increased by 4%, 7%, like John had spoken about before, that we had hoped that we would get, because other school districts got the same increase. And so not having a predictable budget to start the year off makes it really hard to attract staff members and teachers. The second piece is really about the workforce wage gap, and really about how we can direct or specifically target our group of children, our group of students, to align better so that we can attract the right teachers. It talks about ensuring that students are enabled to be served directly by the public school districts of residents who are placed in 853 schools. So what we're talking about is, if a district has a child that maybe needs our services, that they will be able to place that child in our district or in our 853 school. A couple of other things that we tend to lobby for each year. This year, we're specifically looking for, and we're partnering with State Ed on this, that they're asking for a request of about 1.25 million to really help them get better software and reform their tuition rate methodology. And so what we're asking them to do is to talk to people at both a federal level and a state level that can really place some new ideas on how to calculate these rates. Right now, we are paid on, and no other school district in the country does it this way, but we are paid 2 years in arrears. So whatever we had spent, or whatever our rate was issued at 2 years ago, that's what we're able to spend this year. And so there's a constant delay in reimbursement rates because of this old and archaic methodology. And again, we're going to support this because hopefully it will help our tuition rate in the future. One thing that was introduced last year was this hold harmless tuition rate. And again, the reason why we're asking for it again this year is because many of our schools haven't seen students come back. I mean, in New York City, we're hearing anywhere from 27 to 30% of students haven't returned back to district or back to their schools because of the pandemic. And so we're asking that even though our numbers or our admissions are going down, not so much at Reese, but a lot of the other schools around the state, they've seen numbers lower than 20%. Even though that's the case, we really want to make sure that our rates continue to stay the same. So if for example, I spend less money this year, my rate in 2 years won't go below. It will stay the same, even though I didn't spend that money to move forward. And then the other piece, and this is a big ask, is some sort of fiscal reserve fund. So if during 1 year we, we're able to set aside funds from our rate, that we can reinvest that into a future year. And an example of this might be, 1 year, because all of our services come off of our students' IEPs, and that's really what guides us. So if 1 year that we need 4 speech and language related service providers, and the next year we don't have enough services to have to provide 4, we can only provide 3.5, that money stays in our rate, that we can have access to it later on. And we see these trends happen, all over the place, where, or different years, when some years we need more OT and speech and maybe smaller class sizes because of the students that are coming to us. And then the next year, we need maybe more speech and language and not an additional teacher because of class size. And having that flexibility to utilize that budget and move it around, as opposed to following our rate methodology and not being able to save that money from prior years to use in a future year. So those are some of the things that we're trying to prioritize this year. Again, we thank you for any support you can give us. I thank Neil for reaching out to us and giving us this opportunity to speak to you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lester. I think, Alexandra, you can, take the, okay. I could ask 10 questions. I'm just going to ask one because I want to allow other members of the committee to chime in. Just to, without violating anyone's privacy, could you give us an example of a need that our District 75 schools can't meet, that you meet?
So often we see children who, for one reason or another, haven't attended school for, in the last 5 years, we've probably had a dozen students that have been out of school for one reason or another and are aversive to come back to school. And so we're trying to work with the family to get the children sometimes to school. That has definitely increased. A lot of the other services are often because District 75 maybe cannot provide speech and language individual sessions for 5 times a week. And so they'll look to refer those students out to an outside provider.
Okay, that helps. I could ask 10 more questions. I have one overarching question that I'll save to the end that I noticed Claude Winfield, who's a member of our board and a longtime New York City public school principal, has a question.
Yeah, first I have a comment. And Mr. Lester, I want to thank you for that very insightful and informative presentation. You even taught me some stuff that I don't know in all of the years that I was in education. I like to think that I was very cooperative and collaborative with my special ed in my building because my wife was a special ed supervisor. I kind of had to be. But
Yeah.
I have a question. Number one, a comment. After I ask the question, can you explain to people what BOCES is? Because I think a lot of people wouldn't know what it is.
Sure.
The question is though, do you get your kids by way of the Nyquist decision, or is that something that's passe?
So we get our, well, first the question was BOCES, and around the state, it's a board of cooperative educational services. That's what BOCES stands for.
Right.
And so often counties will, or back in time when they were formed, they would create a group, a cooperative of schools, and they would fund a BOCES program to really provide specific services that were needed. So BOCES could provide training for schools. BOCES often would provide outside placement for a lot of developmentally disabled children or learning disabled children that the district, as part of that BOCES, couldn't provide for. And so historically, that's where BOCES have formed. You often, I mean, around New York City, you've got two out in Long Island, Suffolk and Nassau. You have Lower Westchester, just north of you, and then Putnam, Northern Westchester, which is, again, a group of schools that did the same thing. And then as you go further up the state, through the different sections, you'll have different amounts of BOCES. So like in Columbia County, which is quite a bit further up, you might have 2 or 3 counties that provide one BOCES to all the school districts in that area. So I think that was the first question. The second question, if you could just repeat.
I asked, are your kids coming to you by way of their IEPs through the Nyquist decision? And I don't know whether that still exists or not. I'm just asking, is that the way you receive your students? And if so, it's very interesting that you have that condition that you said where some of the students are dropping out and not coming back. Where do they go after they receive a Nyquist decision if they don't return to your school?
So the majority of our students come through CBST referrals, which is the Community Board of CBST, Community Board of Service. I'm not sure what the T is stand for.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's where most of our children come from. Occasionally, we'll work with an educational attorney who is trying to get a student placed through the Office of Impartial Hearings. But we will only take that child now if the referral packet ends up coming through CBST. Some of the other private schools will take a child through impartial hearing, and then pretty much what they do is they sue New York City to get that funding or some of that funding back.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Do any other committee members have a question? Stuart?
Yeah, I'm just trying to discern why Hochul is vetoed this from the very reliable web. It sounds like it's basically a technicality. She feels that you might get funds that you're not entitled to, basically, because you may be given some funds and then you don't have to return them if you don't get the students or something like that. Can you explain what her objection is and if it's that difficult to overcome?
So we reached out to different people. In fact, I even reached out to Brian Benjamin's office because he was our senator for our area, and he's come to visit the Reschool many times. And now being lieutenant governor, I thought I had someone in my pocket. So I called his office, and Phil Gittner, who's the head of staff in that office, really told me he couldn't see a reason why it shouldn't go through. Towards the end, we started hearing about the possibility of it being vetoed. We were told from Cuomo's people that it would have been vetoed before, but with the choice of a new governor, we did think it was going to go through. She seems to be more supportive of education. But I was discussing with Neil beforehand that the possibility of giving up some sort of ownership from the governor's office, of really treating us with parity to school districts, a lot wouldn't be under the control of the governor's budget moving forward for 853 schools. And so we did see it as a kind of an olive branch, that she would give us 4% this year and 11% next year. We do think that if we push forward for next year, that we think because of some of the teams that she's put in place, we could be more persuasive. But yeah, that's what we know so far. We actually work with Hinman and Straub up in Albany, which are a big lobbying group for education around the state. And that was kind of the feedback that we got. It felt, as you put it, Stuart, like it was a technicality that she was going to hold back on, but possibly opening a door for future conversations.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, Stuart. That was informative. Are there any other questions from committee members for Mr. Lester? Abby.
Thanks. I am not very informed in this area, so pardon my question. But I'm just curious if you know if charter schools have parity in this area, and how, and maybe you could just give some background on how your school is different than a charter school.
Fortunate for us, we were formed, 853 Schools was formed, and the name comes from the law that was put into place. It was the Chapter 853 law in education that formed these schools to start providing services for this type of student. Whereas charter schools were brought in at a slightly later stage. And so the history of charter schools isn't as, I don't want to say not as strict, but a lot of the things that charter schools can follow, we're not able to follow. So for example, we have to have New York State certified teachers. We have to follow New York State testing. We have to follow all the IEP guidance, which is a New York State education document. Charter schools are given a set amount similar to us per child. And that money does get pulled from the schools, the local schools budget to fund it. Whereas our money comes from the local schools budget, but is also dictated by the state. So there's more controls from the state than perhaps a charter school would provide. There doesn't seem to be as many charter schools that serve special needs children too, especially in New York City. I mean, I know Success Academy does take some students with IEPs. We actually do get a lot of referrals from them after an initial period. Some children do pretty well at Success. But yeah, it's a little different, and it's a slightly different population. Normally, we're providing more related services due to the IEPs that are set up by the families and the school district than a typical charter school would.
Abby, did that answer your question in the sense that, you know, are they subject to the same lack of parity? Are the charter schools as you are?
John, could I add something?
Sure.
Initially, when charter schools came about, in setting them up, well, one is the locating of them and setting them up. All schools that are public schools in New York City have like a formula for the
Right.
establishment of brand new schools. And they have like a checklist of what should be in those schools. There has been resistance to the charter schools being co-located in many schools throughout the city. So that's part of it. But the Board of Ed did take advantage of some of the charter schools by not providing them the totality of that punch list when you set up a school. I'm talking about books, desks, different things, which then the charter schools chose to almost become like privatized in fundraising and bringing in corporate entities to help fund them. So that is one of the big distinctions between the two public school systems that are trying to operate equally in the same buildings, but not equally at all. You can go through doors and you can tell which part is the charter school and which part is the non-charter school.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Neil Barkley has his hand up, and I see we have several attendees. And if any of you who are attending the meeting want to make a comment, Alexander, is the best way for them to indicate that they want to do so in the chat or the Q&A? How would you like them to do that?
They can just raise their hand and then I can give them
Okay.
the ability to unmute themselves.
So while Neil is speaking, any of the attendees who want to speak, simply raise your hand. Okay. Neil.
Hi, Duncan. So my understanding is that right now with the funding, there isn't parity. It's at 7% for the public schools, and then schools like Reese, they receive 4% the increase annually. You know, as we all know, inflation over the past year has skyrocketed, the highest annual increase in 40 years. And so I'm wondering, with that pressure that's mounting from inflation, is there any consideration of maybe working with the Senate and the Assembly to find more members who are maybe willing to veto the governor?
So just a little bit more history on that. Last year, we got a 0% trend factor, and school districts across the country got something. So yes, you're correct. We're constantly falling behind, and so an 11% and the 4% will average out to like a 5%. But as you see this year, due to inflation, state ed decided 7% across the board to really help school districts out, and then only provided 4% to us. So, you know, there has been this need for parity. I've been going up to Albany lobbying for probably the last 10 years. Typically we go on a Tuesday in February. And I do see that the people up in Albany do know who we are now. You know, having a voice as the 853 coalition has really helped us. And they're often very excited to see us. You know, sometimes we meet with their people. Sometimes we actually meet with some of the officials, elected officials. So I do think that we are going in the right direction with Albany. This year we decided to create for the 853 a parent advocacy group, because similar to yourselves, you know, if we get people from the community to go up and help advocate for us and support us, we think that's going to help. And so, you know, that's our strategy this year and coming up for future years, is really to, you know, get as many elected officials on our side as possible. Do I know whether having a certain percentage of support will help sway the governor, or even some type of ruling that the veto could be reversed? I'm not quite sure on how that piece works, but yeah, and any support, any suggestions that you could make, we will definitely take to Hinman and Straub and see if we can push in certain directions.
Thank you. Stuart, you have your hand up again, and then Claude.
Yeah, I'm not clear on the position of the New York City Department of Education. Do they see this as a zero-sum game, or where do they stand?
In the rate, you mean?
In terms of this bill?
New York City, actually, the Department of Education supported it. And we got support from the teachers unions. We got support from the Department of Education in New York City. And it still got vetoed by the governor. So, you know, and you know, I don't want to go into the rate methodology too much, but if the district's getting a 7% increase, that money isn't following those kids, because we can only increase our rate by 4%. 3% of that money stays in that district now.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, a lot of the districts are like, no, we support this. They're giving us the 7%. Let's, you know, look at parity here. Because they value our services, you know. I've taken kids that have been out of school for 2 or 3 years, and DOE can't get them back in school. And within a couple of years, the kid's doing well, they're fit back in, and we're looking to place them back into a public school or another 853 school to provide the services. So, you know, we love getting on the phone with you know, our chair people for the IEPs and for CBST. You know, they strongly value us, and they're more than willing to write letters of support for the things that we ask for.
Thank you. And Claude, do you have a question?
No, I have a suggestion. About a half an hour before we went online, Harvey Epstein put out his legislative priorities for this year. I didn't have a chance to read them, but I think maybe they're for special ed. And so I think maybe you should try to read them and contact him to see what his position is. Because he just put them out today.
Great, thank you.
And I'm looking over, I don't see anyone with their hand up to speak from our attendees. If anybody does want to speak and you're having trouble raising your hand, just put it in the Q&A. There is one question in the Q&A from Ms. Smalley, Teresa Smalley. Could you provide information on how to join the parent advocacy group?
This fellow runs a 8.
That's what we say now. We never say special.
Okay, so CB6 will, Alexander, are you going to answer that question, or?
I just moved it just so that, yeah, if it was going to be answered live.
Okay, Mr. Lester, could you, how does a parent go about joining the parent advocacy group that
We 853 Coalition Parent Advocacy Group. I can send information over to Neil or any of you
Okay.
how to join. That would be great, you know.
Ms. Smalley, I also see that you have your hand up to speak, but I'm going to recognize Abigail Kruzmark, our committee member, and then we'll voice you so that you have a chance to speak as well. Abby.
Thanks, John. I'm just curious if there are any 853 schools in our district. So we run 14th to 59th east of Lexington.
Yeah, I can pull the list off of the 16 schools. There's definitely a school down there.
There's a Churchill, right? There's
Well, Churchill's a little bit further up, I think. I think it's in the 60s. But again, they're not taking public school children anymore. They're only taking private pay.
Churchill is further up. I think the Gateway used to be down around 14th Street.
Yeah, I think Gateway was down that way. You're correct. Yeah, Gillen Brewer's up closer to us too. You know, those three.
Okay, so that's a good deal. We could get some information on that just to make sure we have it. Alexandra, can you voice Ms. Smalley, who has her hand up to speak?
You can unmute yourself whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I was just saying that in the Q&A, I was adding that Churchill is actually on East 29th Street and 2nd Avenue. And basically, a lot of the reasons that you're saying are Churchill's reasons for why they really announced to the parents the week before school started last year. No, I'm sorry, I should say in the fall of 2020 that they were going private. There's a big backlash. So the grandfathered in students, they had 5 years, and then but any new students applying, like my young son, who really does need a school like this, we would have to go through the attorney route, which I really don't want to do. And so there really are no schools like this. And so I would very much like to get involved. So that's why I had the question about joining the parent advocacy group that 853 has, the coalition.
Could you put your contact information, if you don't mind, in the Q&A?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you.
So that we can get the information to you on that. Thank you.
Just to quickly answer, Learning Spring Elementary School, I think that's down by you. I think that's around 14th.
No, that's around, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, that's around 19th Street.
Oh, 19th.
Yeah, it's across from the park.
Okay. But that's in your region, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah.
the Aaron School as well. Is
Aaron School.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's, East 30th.
Okay, so are any other members of the public who are in attendance who've gone to the trouble of listening to us here? Do you want to speak? Just raise your hand. You see it works if you do. Otherwise, I'm going to move on and have a final question for Mr. Lester, and then some discussion among members of the committee. And do members of the committee have any other questions for Mr. Lester? Okay, my question, I'll give you a second. My question is, what can we do that would be most helpful? I don't like to write resolutions unless I know what they're going to resolve. So, I didn't prepare a resolution for that very reason for tonight. It sounds like one thing I'm just going to do a list of things that have come up here. One thing we could do is we could urge the state assembly and Senate to override the veto. I mean, if you have 100% in favor of a bill and you need 66% to override the bill, the veto, that would seem to be a logical thing, but we don't know what the politics and, in Albany are, but you're up there on lobbying day, so you know what it is. The other thing we could do is we could do a resolution urging strongly urging, Governor Hochul to reconsider. Did she say publicly on the record that she was going to reconsider this, or was that just an off the cuff?
Oh, that's what we heard from behind the scenes. Yeah.
From behind? So we could do a resolution strongly urging Governor Hochul to reconsider her veto of this legislation. Or we could do or we could simply do I don't think it's much use. We could do a resolution of support for you, and that's nice, but I'm not sure that, we do have the opportunity to express our support and then ask for something. So which would be more helpful to you for us to ask to override the veto, which might run into all sorts of political storms and we don't know what's going on, or do a resolution to to urge Governor Hochul to reconsider her veto of this important bill.
I think a reconsideration would be great. I don't know the actual timing of it now that she's vetoed it. People told me she had to sign it before the end of the year. Otherwise, we have to go back again. But I'm not fully aware of that. Your assembly person is
Epstein as well.
Epstein, right?
And Dan Court as well.
Yeah. And reaching out to him to see, what is possible in the Assembly and Senate.
Yeah, they would probably, my understanding is that you're right. If it goes, and Claude could correct me, but if it goes past the end of the year, they would have to, which it has by definition.
They'd have to recycle it.
They would have to recycle the bill. So we could strongly urge the state assembly and Senate to I guess we should use a different word than recycle, but the equivalent of recycle the bills that they had last year, the bills they passed last year unanimously, and then add another resolve. And we strongly urge Governor Hochul to sign the bill this time. I think that sounds to me, and if other committee members have a thought on this, I'm very happy to hear it. But that sounds to me like the best way for us to go, because you're right, it's the veto is done. I mean, and then December 31st, that's all, well, I had forgotten that is all blown up. So if there aren't any other comments from the committee, that's what I would like to do. I'd like to suggest that we prepare, without, forcing any of you to agree to vote for anything. I'd like to prepare a resolution with a lot of detail, asking the state assembly and Senate to recycle, as Claude put it. We'll find the technical legal term for that. The bills that they vetoed, that they passed unanimously last year, and then have a second resolve that we strongly urge Governor Hochul to support this bill, and somewhere in the whereases in the resolution, we would have a note that you gave in answer to Stuart's question, that the DOE has supported this. Virtually everybody has supported this. And it does sound to me a little bit like what you described earlier, that there's some control issue here that is probably a little more arcane than we understand here. So does the committee have any, and my question is there any time sensitivity on this? I mean, the legislature's in session until, I guess until June, right, this year? I don't know how long they're working. Yeah. So we could get this resolution done, in our next meeting, and then present it to our full board after that, assuming that the board members here have agreed to pass it. If they do, I mean, you're all entitled to your votes. That's why you're here. So that's what I'm thinking. Neil, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, that's fine. Sounds good.
Any other committee member want to make a comment on that? Okay, so that's barring, and I invite comment from emails from committee members, or comment from committee members in an appropriate manner, before we next, meet. But otherwise, I will plan to work with our vice chair, Neil Barclay, to prepare a resolution along the lines that I just described for this discussion at our next meeting. And I really want to thank you. And then I think also to get in contact with our assembly. I think Mr. Harvey, Assembly Member Epstein, is very, very helpful on issues like this, and all of our assembly members who work with us are very helpful, not just singling out one, but to get in contact with them and get a little bit of a lay of the land as to where things stand before we do that. Okay, I really want to thank you, Mr. Lester, for being here, and I just can't imagine the kind of dedication it takes to run a school like this under the handicaps that you have, funding wise and otherwise, trying to keep teachers, and the kind of kids you're helping are kids that really, really, really need your help. So thank you very much, and you certainly have the respect of this committee and appreciation of this committee, and we hope we can do something small to be of assistance to you. Thank you. Sir.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. I always like to keep our meetings to an hour. So this is now 7:34, which is almost exactly an hour. I have no other old or new business other than to say that we will be reaching out to school food and school bus services again, and to see if we can get someone from the DOE to come and talk to us about those issues next time.
Can I add something briefly?
Oh, of course, Claude.
Reshma and myself watched the CEC2 Zoning and Planning Committee's meeting on January the 12th. And they met with the school construction authority. And you can see that meeting on YouTube if you want, but it's very informative about the process of establishing capital construction projects for the schools throughout the district. And the deadline for the presentation was January the 14th. And that was the deadline. The CEC did say that they would allow the schools to submit recommendations after the deadline, but they're only recommendations. So if anyone's interested in that process, it's good to see, because it also tells you who for this district is the liaison to the school construction authority. I think his name is Joshua Adams and Andrea Bender. Do you know them, John?
I've heard both of their names, but I don't know them.
Yeah, and also the deputy director for school facilities is Thomas Francenetti. So it would be interesting for you to have that information in the back of your head. One interesting thing did come up. Someone was asking about a project that might be considered a capital construction project for PS 150. I'm not that familiar with the schools, but they were told PS 150 is a relatively new school.
Yes.
And so therefore it doesn't qualify for capital funding for 5 years.
Could you send me a link to that? Would you be able to do that easy, or I could just go to the CEC2 website?
If you get the CEC's a notice, it has a link on it.
Okay, I do it. I really wasn't doing very well the first 2 weeks of this month, and I probably missed it. Okay.
And Claude, I just wanted to ask, you had said something about Assembly Member Epstein, that he put something out about a focus on
Yeah, today he
education.
put out his list of priority bills that he's focusing on for people with disabilities. That's the term that he uses now, people with disabilities. I think it's a package of 1, 2, my wife just printed it out for me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. A package of 8 bills dealing with people with disabilities. So that's why I said he would probably be a person of interest in this area. So that's why I was suggesting to Mr. Lester that he contact him.
Okay, and that's very helpful, and I think, you know, he's been very helpful to us in the past, so I'm sure he would again. Thank you. Any other old or new business? Okay, seeing none, I'm with gratitude to Mr. Lester for being here and Neil for setting this up with him. I'm adjourning this meeting at 7:39 p.m. Thank you all for being here.